Hello and welcome to Perspectives on Faith. I'm your host, Amir Hussain. Our guest today is Dr. D. Fairchild Ruggles, who is a professor of landscape architecture, and art history at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be here and do the kinds of things that you do?
Well, it's been an unusual path, not the typical academic path, because I did not start off wanting to be a historian of Islamic architecture or Islamic landscape. I wanted to be an artist, and as an undergraduate studied art, loved it, also liked landscape, thought I might become a landscape architect, and went off to New York after graduation and thought I would become an artist, and of course I didn't. I mean, how many people do become artists?
Actually become successful at that, exactly.
It's very difficult. And became much more interested in the history of art and went off to graduate school, where I encountered a very magnetic teacher. I think that happens for many people. It's really the
where
teachers.
Was this?
This was at the University of Pennsylvania in the art history department, and became more and more interested in Islamic culture, which I really knew nothing about prior to that. It's very interesting how school can have that effect on you. It really can be the door through which new experiences become possible. And realized that the architecture that I was studying really had very powerful landscape elements, that you couldn't study the architecture without studying the landscape, because being Mediterranean climate, warm climate, it's very open, so that the architecture really looks to the out of doors. The out of doors is sort of set up to be seen from the architecture, and slowly became more and more of a landscape historian, and certainly less and less of an artist, as I left that behind.
But I think you still keep that in the work. So tell me about the dissertation that you wrote, the graduate work that you did.
So the dissertation was an interesting story too, actually, because I knew I wanted to do something in Islamic architectural history. I wanted to work on the earlier periods rather than the more modern periods. And at that time, as a poor graduate student, the furthest I could go, the only ticket I could afford, was a ticket that got me to Spain.
Okay.
I would have liked to have gone further. If I'd gone to Egypt, I might have worked on different things. But I went to Spain, actually Spain and Morocco, and really enjoyed it a lot, still do, love going back to Spain and Morocco, and found that outside of Cordoba there was a palace city, a huge architectural complex called Medinat Sarra, that was virtually unstudied. It had the importance in the early Islamic world of a place like Pompeii, but or the Topkapi. You can imagine something of that magnitude, that kind of importance, the single biggest palace, certainly in Western Islam in its day, right up through probably the 11th or 12th century. And it had been studied, but the man who had studied it had died without publishing his notes. So it was really only published through these very almost incoherent notes.
Right.
And it wasn't the gardens that had been studied, it was the architecture. So it was an opportunity for a young scholar to work on something that, I didn't discover it, but I was kind of the first one to look at the gardens in a serious kind of, comprehensive manner. And that was my dissertation.
Wonderful. And then how long have you been here at Urbana-Champaign?
I've been here for 7 years.
What kinds of courses do you teach here?
I teach courses in Islamic landscape history to landscape architects, because I tell them they may end up designing places in the Emirates or Turkey or South Asia or Morocco. We now work all over the world.
Or imagine even for people from the Muslim world who come here to the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, studying any cultural landscape, you learn problem solving. And that's ultimately what they're called upon to do as landscape architects. So I teach a course on the history of landscape architecture in the Islamic world that starts with 7th century, goes right up to the 21st century with a park built in Cairo. And I also teach graduate seminars, because we have a PhD program in landscape history. And there I'll typically teach something like the three cultures of Spain, Muslims, Christians, Jews in Spain, and their built environment and the art. Or recently I taught a course on Mughal Palaces, which includes gardens, landscape, and architecture, and the arts. And of course, social history. So.
But that's
weaving
great
it all
though, because
together.
I don't think you can study the architecture without studying the landscape, because that's integral to it. I mean, when they build these buildings, like for example the Taj Mahal, if you're talking about one of the jewels of Mughal architecture, you can't simply look at the building without looking at the context in which it's situated.
Absolutely. That landscape really sets up the Taj Mahal. And of course, the Taj is situated not just in a man-made landscape, but also on the banks of a river. So it's also taking advantage of existing landscape to heighten the drama of the building.
Right. Now, your first book was Gardens, Landscape, and Vision in the Palaces of Islamic Spain. Talk to us about those terms, because we can talk about gardens in Islamic Spain, landscape in Islamic Spain, vision in Islamic Spain, palaces in Islamic Spain.
Yes. I was trying to weave them together very consciously, because as an architect, as a student of architectural history, I had learned to study buildings in isolation. Not by design, it's just sort of the way architectural history traditionally used to be taught. Right. Although at Penn it was not taught that way. It was much more contextualized. So I was trying very hard to talk about landscape and architecture in the same voice, the same breath. And the connection between the two is that word vision, because it's in looking. As you said, you can't really see the Taj Mahal unless you are in the garden, looking through the garden at the Taj. And that's vision. It's about visual kind of axes, sometimes we say visual strategies when we want to be really kind of sound sophisticated. And really the way that the human being encounters architecture is often in a spatial situation that is landscape, whether it's within the kind of intimate space of a courtyard or outside in that larger, more imposing space of a natural environment. So that's what I was trying to do in that first book, was to really to kind of foreground that idea of vision and how important it is. Because it's also where the human being shows up. We can talk about buildings and we can talk about landscape as if they existed apart from us. But it's when we put ourselves in those spaces that you start to see the relationship between them, because the relationship between them is really perceived by a human being with eyes and standing 5 feet off the ground. Very, very human.
Sure. And you've had the privilege of working in different places. It's not just Islamic Spain, but you're talking about the Mughal period. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the varieties, let's say, of landscape or gardens that you've worked in?
Well, there is such tremendous variety. I mean, the Islamic world is huge, and I think that's actually quite daunting for a scholar whose work depends on nature to some extent. Right. I started talking, I think at the very beginning, about the Mediterranean, how I loved the Mediterranean, and that's partly why I went to Spain. And the Mediterranean is very coherent. So Italy, Spain, Morocco, Egypt have a lot in common. Very long, dry summers, wet winters, but not very wet. A lot of similar water issues, a lot of similar plant palette. But
similar foods.
Similar foods, exactly, yeah. And everybody, of course, claims that it's theirs.
Right.
But if you start to go further north, for example, into Turkey, you get to climates that really can be quite cold. Particularly in the wintertime, and quite rainy also. So the architecture has to change, and the gardens, of course, change. And then when you go to South Asia, you go to Central Asia, and then to South Asia, to India, Pakistan, it's an entirely different plant palette. And it's a fairly well-known statement by Babur, the Emperor Babur, as he conquered India, who, coming from Central Asia into South Asia, was aghast because he found it sort of like Illinois, sort of flat and dry with no landscape, no running water, and the plants were different. The only good thing was that the melons were, tasted good, and the fruit was very good. So there were things that he liked about it. But he himself, there's someone moving what would, from my perspective here in the United States, it doesn't look like a very long distance from Central Asia to South Asia, but he found the difference really striking to him. So from a landscape point of view, that means you're dealing with really very different natural environments, very different plant palettes, and very different sort of aesthetic environments as well. Mountains versus rivers versus Mediterranean.
Absolutely, and the architecture is different in those places, and that's one of those things that we don't think about, particularly here in America post 9/11. We tend not to have sort of positive associations with Islam, and certainly not in terms of great artistic beauty. And yet, as I'm sure you do, I point out to my students that everyone's list of the top 10 most beautiful buildings in the world includes at least one Muslim building, the Taj Mahal, if not for other places. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of the architecture that you've studied, or some of the architecture that really speaks to you from the Islamic world.
Oh, I just, there's so many buildings that I just really admire and find quite beautiful. And I think one of the things I find quite beautiful about the buildings of the Islamic world is that it's the architecture that does the work. The architecture is the building. And that may sound self-evident, but if you think of Christian cathedrals, so often what we focus on is not just the architecture, but the sculptural program, where there's this very complicated iconography of saints doing this and doing that, and people going to heaven and people going to hell. And you have to decode all that to understand what the building is trying to say to you. What I love about the Islamic world is that it's the building that does all of that. There is no, and inscriptions. Right. Of course, the inscriptions do a lot of work too, but it's the building. So for example, the great Mosque of Cordoba, which is one of my all-time favorite buildings, is beautiful in part for its simplicity. It doesn't have to work that hard to be absolutely awe-inspiring and sort of magisterial in its dimensions and the kind of weight and gravity of it. So that's one of my all-time favorite buildings. And as you said, there's tremendous variety too. So one of the hard things with students is to explain that there is tremendous variety, and at the same time there's tremendous unity. So the inscriptions are almost all written in the same language, unless you're talking about, foundation inscriptions or poetic inscriptions. But if it's Quranic, it's all the same language, and that's going to be true whether you're in Spain or whether you're in Indonesia. And so there's that kind of unity. And then there's a certain unity of forms where certain mosque plans appear over and over again.
Sure, because you've got a space that needs to be accommodating thousands of people lining up in rows to pray.
And accommodating people according to the same set of values, like equality. The idea that there's no priesthood dominates mosque design, especially in the early period.
I mentioned with the water too, because if you have to have a source, in the modern world, of course, you have faucets, things like that, but you have, I assume, fountains.
Fountains, which are so important for practical reasons. Also, you have to have them for ritual reasons, of course. And the mosque, we forget that some early mosques were also the places where water was provided to the community, that there were fountains associated with them that people used for daily cooking needs as well. I don't mean in the mosque, I mean sometimes outside as a kind of public service. So anyway, great continuity, great diversity, and some of the challenge sometimes is seeing the unity underneath the diversity. So even though the Taj doesn't look like the Great Mosque of Cordoba, for example, one is a tomb, one is a mosque, there are some similarities. One is the emphasis on nature within the building. Both have gardened courtyards. Both have important inscription programs. Both are places where one contemplates the afterlife, eternity. There's enormous similarity underneath the kind of decorative diversity.
Now, you've done work on water use and water resources. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because I think that becomes really important to say, how do you use this resource? In the 21st century, of course, it's a huge issue of water conservation.
Huge. It's actually becoming more and more important. You'd think that we would have solved the problem. What we've really done is created the problem. Because until the modern world, until we started taking water out of the aquifers under the desert, we were doing fine, because water was replenishable, it was renewable, and of course we know that it no longer is with the great dams and the depletion of the aquifers. I am fascinated by water, and I'm fascinated by water particularly in regards to gardens and landscape. People talk about gardens and landscapes as always having a theological dimension, always have a symbolic dimension. It's always a kind of intellectual project, and it is that. But part of what gardens and landscape are about, I have to say are because they're slightly different, in the early Islamic world is really problem solving. How do we get water so that we can sustain a city according to high standards, not low standards, but high standards. And that involves trapping water. And so there's this whole elaborate set of devices, of techniques, that many of which are learned from the Romans, although some are in fact not learned from the Romans. That are brought to bear on the same landscape. So you'll find landscapes that have these levers by which water is actually lifted out of rivers or out of wells, and you have water wheels by which water is lifted. In some cases the water isn't lifted, it's actually propelled by the river itself, so that the river is doing both the supplying of the water and also the movement of the wheel, the mechanical, so it's a source of power, which is incredibly economical when you think about it. And then aqueducts, and the aqueducts seem very simple, like, oh, just build some bridges and you'll bring the water. But in fact, it takes enormous geometrical know-how to make that water flow at a perfectly even slope. Too steep, you're going to end up with water splashing all over the place and wasted. Too little, and the water will just sit there and it won't go. So it takes kind of a long-range application of geometrical principles to build an aqueduct. And then things like qanats, these underground water conduits that are, I find people, when I talk about this kind of stuff, that's the stuff that people really love. The idea
where do you work on those? What areas? Yeah.
Well, Iran has lots of qanats. I don't work on them myself. I've never been in a qanat. That's my lifelong ambition, is actually to be lowered into one and actually see it from within.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's very dangerous.
But tell us about them. Tell us more about them.
Well, they're fascinating because it's a whole water system that's invisible to the eye. You don't even see it there. The only thing you see is the results of it, which is this garden erupting in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a very arid landscape. So it seems kind of miraculous. To just suddenly have greenery and trees and an oasis that's made by human beings. But it's not made by just any human beings, it's made by engineers who really understand, again, not only how to control slope from a geometrical point of view, but also they have to understand how to tap the water at the mountains, which is where the water actually comes from. So what a qanat does is it's capturing water from mountains, way off in the distance, capturing snow melt, rainfall, and then capturing it underground in the sort of spongy area at the foot of the mountain, and then carrying it for sometimes miles and miles and miles across a very dry landscape to create this oasis. Very dramatic. So those kinds of things sometimes are, and at the end there may be water wheels that are, because there may be a cistern that's collecting all this qanat water, and then you'll have water wheels that are actually lifting it up and sending it off into the various canals. It's quite wonderful. And it's not just a technical kind of, I don't want to call it a miracle because that's not what it is, but it's not sort of a technical tour de force, but it's also a social one because you have this scarce resource that then has to be allocated in a way that is just. So you also have the kind of a set of social contracts or social agreements that have to be in place so that people can agree who will get the water when, so they won't actually fight over it. That's quite wonderful to think that human society might actually be formed around the fair distribution of a scarce resource like water.
Well, if you could talk to us a little bit more about that, because as you were saying that, it made me think of where I live in Los Angeles, and when I moved there from Toronto, I thought, this is a desert, and the only reason that this city exists is because we steal the water from the Colorado River, from the Owens Valley, and you bring that water in, and huge issues around how do you allocate that water, who has access to the water, particularly if you're looking at oceanfront property, a very different kind of water in the sense it's not for drinking water, it's the sense of looking at this view, but how do you allocate that? Do you make the beaches public? Do people have the right to walk along the ocean, or is that private property? Were those things dealt with, or were those questions in the Islamic world?
They are. I mean, there's a whole set of water law, a whole kind of system of water law that arises around this. And I'm not recalling exactly how it works, but there's sort of two different attitudes towards water. One is that if you buy the land, you get the water that's on the land.
Okay.
And the other system, I mean, this is making it very simple, the other system is that you can buy and sell water like a commodity, that it's actually not connected to the land at all. So you could actually buy and sell your water rights or bequeath them to your sons and daughters. And those are different legal principles altogether, and they operate differently in different parts of the Islamic world. So that's an example where social organization arises around water. Yeah, Los Angeles is kind of a nightmare when it comes to water.
The water resources, you have so many people and so few water. You mentioned earlier the difference between gardens and landscapes, and I wonder if you can tease that out a little bit for us, because most of us probably, when you think of garden, think of landscape, think these are synonymous, and yet they're different.
We tend to think of gardens as being aesthetic, as having a kind of visual, there by visual design, something to look at, and also, or maybe I should say sensory, because we know from poetry, from descriptions, that gardens are not only to look at but also to smell. Smell is a very powerful sensation that is not really there in modern gardens. We don't talk about, oh, I saw the most wonderful garden. You say, I saw the most wonderful garden. You don't come home and say, oh, I smelled the most wonderful garden today. But that is what they write about, is the smell of the garden, how beautiful the scent is. And if you imagine the medieval world, the 10th, 11th century, things probably didn't always smell all that
Smells.
wonderful, so a garden would have been especially delightful.
Well, and things are just so different in different places. Just going back to Los Angeles, when I moved there, I had no idea that citrus trees smelled as lovely as they did. And so you get the scent of orange blossoms on the wind, or you get the jasmine. To live in a place where jasmine is used as a bedding material.
Yeah.
And so you get that scent, particularly in the evening. It's this amazing scent, and the lemon trees smell a little different than the orange trees, smell a little different than the grapefruit trees.
So you have both the scent and the flower, and then you also, of course, have the fruit, which is another sense because there's also taste.
Sure.
And I think all of these are very much present in gardens. Well, so the garden as a sensory environment, the landscape is, of course, closely related to the garden. I mean, gardens and landscape are the same thing. It's trees, it's plants, it's soil, it's water. The difference is that the landscape can also be utterly utilitarian. It can be the place where you grow your wheat, or the place where you harvest your water, if it's a kind of a watershed area. So landscape can be very utilitarian, and in order to study it, I had to do, I'm trained as an art historian, but I had to do a lot of agricultural history. I had to understand what the farm economy was, for example, in Spain in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. And I had to do some botanical sort of economic botany, or I think that's what they call it, where you really understand what the relative value of different plants is, and which ones were for export and which ones were for home consumption. Because that's a way of understanding what a working, productive, cultivated landscape was like. Gardens are also utilitarian. They have that dimension. As you said, the taste of the orange, that these are very practical things that are grown there, but I think they're grown there primarily for expressive reasons, for reasons to appeal to the senses and perhaps to refer to the larger landscape. I mean, if you live in California, you might have a garden in your backyard. That garden is really a reference to the agricultural history of California, which was as a citrus growing state. And that's true. I think that's the relationship between gardens and landscapes probably throughout the world.
Now, could you tell us a little bit more about screens in the Islamic world, and how they function, what they do? Sure,
yeah. The screen is to me, the screen is a very important part of architecture and landscape because it's often the thing that divides the architecture from the landscape. And we find screens in all kinds of situations. We find them covering windows, blocking, keeping the sun from coming in so the interior doesn't get too hot, blocking doorways sometimes blocking windows so that you can look out to the street and see what's going on without being seen, so there's a kind of privacy.
And people can't look in, exactly.
Yeah, privacy issue. And even around tombs, which is a very strange and interesting example of screens because there's no real reason
why would you
why
need a screen
you
for a
need
tomb?
one. Right. But metaphorically it's very important because it divides here from there, which is very important when you're talking about the living and the dead. I mean, that's a pretty powerful line of separation, and I think that's why they're there around screens. Also, perhaps to, as a mark of respect, to sort of to keep the sacred space, that very powerful space within, kind of away from people, so you can't just go in and touch. So that's one aspect of screens. The other aspect of screens is a purely visual one, and that is, why is it that we put screens? We know functionally that if you put a screen over a window, it will keep the sun from coming in. But why is it that we put screens in places that we want to look out of? Is it to prevent us from looking out? No, because we just said that you can look out on the street without being seen. So there's a thing that happens visually with a screen where when you see it from a distance, it looks like it's preventing vision. You really can't see through it. You're just seeing the beautiful patterns, wooden or marble or perhaps plaster, carved patterns of the screen. But the closer you get, the screen itself starts to dissolve and you're looking through it.
Through the screen.
Because your focal length, your visual focal length has changed, and you're looking through it at what's beyond it. So the screen does this thing where it kind of marks that line between interior space and exterior space. And there's a moment where physically your eyes have to decide whether they're on the inside or on the outside. Are they looking at the screen itself, or suddenly you readjust your vision, are you looking beyond? And it's a really very powerful thing that happens inside the brain too, because you suddenly have visually stepped outside of the space that you're in.
Right. And it's a cross-religious thing, because when you were talking about screens, it made me think of, for example, in the Catholic Church pre-Vatican II, the altar, is not seen. In the Orthodox churches, you have the screen. Right, the choir screen. Or in the Orthodox church, the screen that's the iconostasis, where you put the icons, because again, you keep the altar from public view.
Absolutely, yeah. and it's more than a physical space. It's really a kind of metaphorical line that's being drawn.
Right,
And it's not just drawn on the ground,
space,
it's
yeah.
drawn in space to keep you away from whatever, that highly charged space on the other side.
You must see this when you do work on Spain, that it's not just Islamic Spain, but it's Jewish Spain and it's Christian Spain, and these things must
Absolutely.
come together.
Absolutely. Well, and think of the screen of the confessional, in the Catholic Church, another one where everyone knows who's on both sides of that screen, but that screen provides the kind of anonymity or the ability to speak about things that are otherwise hard to speak about. So the screen is very highly charged. And it can be at ground level, it can be, sometimes you see it up in the air actually, filtering light so that as the light comes through it, there's a beautiful screen. I think my all-time favorite screens are the ones in the tomb at Fatehpur Sikri, in the great mosque, the congregational mosque at Fatehpur Sikri, near Agra in India, where the entire thing is surrounded by screens. So that from any angle of the day, wherever the sun is shining into the tomb through these screens that are then projected onto the floor, so that the floor, which is just plain stone, becomes very enlivened by that sort of texture that's nothing more than just light and dark, just the filtering of the light.
And that's photography, it's light and darkness, but that's also, you look at the modern world and the laser things you get now, designs, images there, and yet this is a very old way of having a continually changing pattern on your floor.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about some of the work that you've done comparatively, just between, let's say, Fatehpur Sikri in Agra and Spain. What do you see with screens there?
Well, in Spain finishes, 1492 is production of Islamic objects has really stopped. And that's about the time when India is, and Pakistan, South Asia is getting going. So there's a time difference. And for that reason, the material that we see in South Asia is really much more modern.
Okay.
It's larger in scale, it's from an engineering point of view, more sophisticated, and it's, what's the word, costlier. And much of it survives, unlike in Spain, where a lot of it, partly because it's older, partly because it was a conquered civilization, a lot of it's not there anymore. When I think of the number of monuments in Istanbul compared to the number of monuments in Cordoba, it just makes me weep, because I know they're all, they were there, but they're all gone.
Yeah.
So, but that's the nature of changing times, I guess.
When we come back from the break, I'd like to talk with you more about that. Please stay tuned for more of our conversation with Professor D. Fairchild Ruggles on Perspectives on Faith. Hello, and welcome back to Perspectives on Faith. I'm your host, Amir Hussain. Our guest is Professor D. Fairchild Ruggles, who is Professor of Landscape Architecture, Architecture and Art History at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We were talking at the break about issues of privacy. I live in Los Angeles, which has some of the wealthiest homes in the world, not just in America, but in the world. And it struck me that there's interesting similarities with the Muslim world, that the sense of privacy there, the sort of expensive homes you see, the really expensive homes you don't see. And I remember going to a home in Bel Air off of Sunset, and you had no idea that this house even existed. And then you turn the corner, and there it is in all its splendor. And so if you could talk a little bit about privacy and public space, private space, public space, in the Islamic world.
Yeah, and in the Islamic world, I think the popular conception, at least in the West, is that it's, culture obsessed with privacy, which is ridiculous. It's a culture that knows how to distinguish between public and private. But as you were saying, it's often a function of class, where, if you're really poor, you don't have the luxury of even hiding your own body. I mean, if we think of just the covering of the body, it's very much dependent on one's financial security.
The house that's open to the elements.
Yeah, exactly. So, and there are different ways of achieving privacy. Obviously, one is through the covering of the body. Another is through the screening of windows and the screening of doors, and also just not having windows that look out on the street at all, but windows that look into a courtyard. Again, you have to be well enough off that you have a large enough house that you can do that. And then the street plan itself, I'm thinking particularly in pre-modern cities in the Islamic world, that the street plan will help guide privacy by not having long thoroughfares that run through the city where you can see from one end of the city to the next. I'm thinking of the Champs-Élysées in Paris, or Fifth Avenue in New York, which are these real sort of scopic, sort of tunnels that run through the city. If you think of Cordoba, or you think of, Fez, or some of these older cities, these are narrow, winding streets, not because there's a lack of plan, but because there's a high premium placed on visual privacy.
Right.
You don't want to be able to look straight into someone's
Into your
doorway,
neighbors,
into their house. So there's all different ways of affecting privacy.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about where the modern and the traditional intersect, because I'm sure you see in the Arab world, for example, this monumental building that's taking place. I'm thinking now of places like, let's say, in the Emirates, where, forget about 50 years ago, 10 years ago, it didn't look what it looked like now. Is there a reclaiming of traditional kinds of things? Where does the modern, the traditional, the ancient intersect in the Islamic world?
I think there's some wonderful examples of reclaiming the past. I think there are also some regrettable examples of just not caring enough about it. I was in Qatar, and it's very impressive, very progressive education city. Pretty phenomenal idea to have this multiplex campus. But at the same time, not a huge attention being paid to the traditional. So it's an example of a very modern architecture, modern architectural idiom that, of course, is a reflection of great wealth, but there are these older buildings that are, in fact, being swept away. They're not being cared for. And I do wonder if maybe 15, 20, 25 years down the road in Qatar, in Doha, they'll look back and say, oh, we should have saved a little piece of the way it used to be, just for as a foil, just as a contrast. But I don't see that happening yet. I hope it will happen. I hope there's still time. And then in terms of using the past in a productive way, I think there's some wonderful examples of that. If we go back to gardens, for example, and landscape. In Cairo, I was there just a few years ago, and it was just a few months after Azhar Park had opened up.
And this is a development that's done by the Aga Khan Development Network, right?
Yes, yes, on a prominent hill near the Citadel in Cairo. And it's just a phenomenal project that is also, I think, a pretty sensitive project in that they built in a lot of social programming for what was a fairly poor neighborhood, and thought a lot about water and access to water, and thought about archaeology. That was one of the kind of controversial aspects of the park, was that, of course, you can't dig anywhere in Cairo without hitting something archaeological.
And it hits the Ayyubid Wall, does it not?
Yeah. They did a fair amount of archaeology there, but some people say not enough.
Right.
But in terms of the design of the garden, it is a phenomenal use of older Islamic forms for a garden that looks utterly new, utterly modern. There's nothing about it that would make you say, oh, this is old. And yet, when you walk in there, you would say, this is Islamic, because of the way that it makes reference to the past, with long axial water channels, which is the kind of thing you find traditionally in Islamic gardens, with use of beautiful multicolored marble, laid out almost mosaic-like on the ground, which is something you see throughout Cairo, throughout Syria, with fountains and water channels and actually wanted to say water cascades, these kind of cataracts, these chadars. Lots of, and geometry, lots of references to the past, but in a way that's not kind of chained to the past. It's really reinterpreting the past. So I think it's quite possible to use the past in a very creative way and also in a very modern way.
And also in a very way that enforces social justice, because that park, Azhar Park in Cairo, used to be on the side of a refuse dump, and now it's public space, because we talked about the wealthy and the poor. The wealthy have their gardens, the poor don't. How do you create effective public space for the poor? Or public garden space for the poor?
Yeah, and particularly in congested places like Cairo that don't have that many gardens, or the garden tradition that they have has been traditionally reserved for the well-to-do. My impression, what I understood from Azhar Park, was that they even they've certainly paid attention to the neighborhood around it, providing services and jobs, but also different entry fees, so that depending on where you live, if you live in the poorer neighborhood nearby, you can get in for a very, very tiny sum of money. Whereas if you come, carrying dollars, or if you come from, Istanbul, you pay a much higher price, which is appropriate.
Absolutely, absolutely. your new book is Islamic Gardens and Landscapes, and I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about just that notion of Islamic gardens. I mean, is that too broad a notion because the world of Islam is so big, and of course the history is 1400 years, or are there things we can point to as something that's common about an Islamic garden that sets it apart, let's say, from a Chinese garden or a English rose garden?
That's very problematic, and I have to say in the book I really grappled with it because I don't really think there is an Islamic garden. Okay. The problem is I'm not sure what the word Islamic refers to. Does it refer to the style of a garden? Does it refer to the countries where these gardens are made? In which case, can you make a garden in Spain today, and is it then a Christian garden or an Islamic garden? Does it refer to the people who built it? Does it refer to the person who commissioned it? It's like, where does that word lodge, this word Islamic? And that's true for architecture too. It's not just true of gardens. So I grappled with it, and I'm still not entirely sure what it means. I do know that I made a decision in the book to include gardens that are not, strictly speaking, Muslim. Meaning I included, for example, a garden in Hawaii built for the Doris Duke estate called Shangri-La. Really beautiful estate, kind of a Hollywood movie star kind of estate. She was a very, very wealthy woman. I think in her day she was the wealthiest American woman or the wealthiest woman in the world, something just phenomenal like that. And she loved Islamic architecture, and she traveled to India, to Syria, to Egypt. She traveled all over the Islamic world. She traveled all over the world and built in her estate some gardens that evoke, in one case, a Persian garden, in another case, what they call the Mughal Garden. To me, it doesn't actually look all that Indian. But I understand why they call it the Mughal Garden. It has a chadar, or it has a chinikhana, which is this kind of panel. The water flows over this panel of little niches. It's very lively, very beautiful. And then it flows down the center of the garden in this long, narrow channel flanked by vegetation. So it's called the Mughal Garden. And I included that in the book because to me, if she had been looking at Islamic gardens and was reproducing
and very consciously reproduced that.
It is the child, the stepchild of Islamic gardens. I also included gardens that were built in India by non-Muslims, in which they were very clearly imitating gardens in places like the Taj Mahal. These were Hindu patrons or Jain, I think they're for the most part Rajput Hindu patrons who are building what looks, if you didn't know that the patron wasn't Muslim, you would think that it was an Islamic garden. So I included that because it struck me that isn't that one of the signs of the power of Islamic art and architecture, that it spreads to people who don't necessarily espouse the theology, but love the culture and want to participate.
And it's also an example of a shared culture, because that culture in India, it's not just Muslims, it's Hindus, it's Sikhs, it's Jains, it's Christians. If you look at where you started in Islamic Spain, or medieval Spain, I don't like the term Islam. I see your issue of Islamic Spain, using that Islamic as the adjective there, because it's as much influenced by Muslim things as it is by Jewish things, as it is by Christian things.
It's hard to know what to call Spain, because if you have a Muslim minority ruling over a Christian majority, and the administrative class is Jews, what do you call that people? I don't know, Andalusian. It's very hard to know. And of course it's a problematic term too, because we don't use Islamic and Christian in parallel ways. Christian refers to the religion. We rarely talk about culture. We talk about culture as being European.
But we don't say Christian
Islam
architecture.
And Islamic, well, I think in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, people would talk about Mohammedan culture, because they were trying to, if Christ produces Christian, then it must be the prophet who produces Islamic. You can see where that mistake happens.
Talk to us a little bit about some of the gardens, let's say, in Spain, and maybe how they're different from, let's say, the gardens in India. I mean, I know, for example, in Islamic India, that sense of the charbagh, having the 4-section garden. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, and then maybe how that's similar, or is that totally different in the Spanish context?
Well, by the time of India and Pakistan, it is very developed. So you almost always have gardens that have some form of what we call the chaharbagh, or quadripartite divisioning, 4-part divisioning. And not just that, but 16-part, 32-part, these sort of enormous geometrical schemes. It's rare not to have that. In Spain, it's actually unusual to find that. The norm is not so much to have a 4-part garden, but to have a garden with at least a channel running through it or a tank of water in it. So there are only a handful of 4-part gardens that I can think of in Spain, and that's partly because it's the early period. Right. And this is part of the problem with talking about Islamic gardens, is that of course they change historically, sure, as any cultural development does. So the early gardens are much simpler, and well, they're just much simpler. Yeah. And the later ones, and India is an example of some of the latest quote-unquote Islamic gardens, are really very elaborate. They're huge, they're elaborate, they're complex, they're geometrically sort of carried out to the nth degree.
Mm-hmm. And the rulers paid attention to the gardens. This goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that it wasn't as if someone commissioned a building and just sort of plunked that building down in the middle of nowhere. I'm thinking now of another tomb, Humayun's tomb. Well, but the gardens, and I think there's a project underway to restore some of those gardens.
Indeed, those gardens have been restored.
Okay.
That building is almost finished. What they're doing now is, and it's again an Aga Khan sponsored project in conjunction with the government of India. Now what they're doing is they're in phase 2, which is to do the nursery. There's a historic nursery next door where plants were grown, and then to do some of the neighborhoods in the area that are run down but historic, have many wonderful monuments in them, and to clean them up. So that's a wonderful success story. That's an interesting one though, because that is a garden that, if you think about it, it was designed to be a tomb. It was not designed to be a public park. In the 21st century, it is a public park. Right. People go there, it's where you take your family on an outing.
It's a
you
green
can have
space
lunch
to
there.
hang out.
Yeah, you go read, you walk around, you relax, you sleep. A lot of people sleep in that garden. And so it had to, in the restoration, it had to be restored for that new purpose, keeping an eye on history, wanting to make it historically accurate, but at the same time also wanting to make it serve a new democratic public. And one of the decisions that was made that most people don't know is that they planted it with turf, with grass. Okay. But historically, it wasn't planted with grass. It was planted with clover. Okay. But clover is very delicate underfoot. It's easily crushed.
It's crushed underfoot. Yeah.
Whereas if you have lots of families running around playing cricket or whatever they're doing there, I hope they're not playing cricket there, but just running around and picnicking and stomping on the grass, then you need something more durable. That's a case where sort of past and present collide, and you have to make a decision about. Maybe we should privilege the present.
You started as an artist, and in many ways you still are in terms of the writing and the work you do. Take us through sort of your artist eyes in looking at these gardens and places. It's always difficult to ask, what are your favorite kinds of places, but can you talk to us a little bit about why your favorite places are your favorite places and what those are, and what's the artistic appeal of that for you?
That's a hard question to answer, because first of all, I have a lot of favorite places.
Yeah.
Every time I travel, I find new favorite places. So it's like you have to kind of open your heart and make room for yet another favorite monument.
I was picking a sample, totally at random, of some of those favorite places. Okay.
I would have to say, is one of my all-time favorites. I like it much better than the Taj Mahal because it's simpler, much simpler. There's a dignity to it. It's also got this, it's red. It's that darker color. The Taj Mahal is very white and very kind of ethereal. There's something very solid about Humayun's tomb that I love. And I also love the way the water runs through that garden. You can just see it articulating the quadrants that make up that sort of, I think it's 16 in that case, 16 beds in the garden. And there's something harmoniously balanced about it. I really like things that are symmetrical, and I like things that are well balanced. And so that's an all-time favorite. Mosque of Cordoba, all-time favorite. I like the Alhambra, but it's a little over-decorated. Sometimes it feels just a little too busy, too much going on. I like buildings that are a little simpler.
Yeah.
Those are some of my favorites. I tend to like buildings that are early examples of something where you can see the architect working on a problem and not quite finished yet, not quite. The Taj, it's finished. What more can you say? They've done it. They've done the dome. They've done the minarets. They've done the largest garden you could possibly imagine. Humayun's tomb was an earlier stage in that process where they were working out what a monumental tomb should look like. It was the first monumental tomb in India, after all. And so they were still kind of figuring out what should a monumental tomb look like. to be in the mind of an architect at that moment, where we take it for granted because we're looking as historians backwards in time. It's all done, it's all finished. Of course it should have been built like that. But to be the architect thinking, should we make it big and bulbous? Should we make it large and flat? Should we put minarets on it? To be at that moment in architectural history where you're actually making big decisions about things that we now look back on.
Could you talk to us just a little bit, just changing gears a bit, about your teachers? You mentioned that there's one person that was really magnetic and sort of, I don't know if guided you is the right word, but inspired you into this. And one of the questions I always love to ask fellow academics is that, who are the teachers, and if you want to name names, that's great. Sometimes people are reluctant because you forget other people. But who are some of the teachers that have influenced you and how they influenced you?
Well, I will name names. My teacher in graduate school was Renata Hollid, and she is a fiery character and very inspiring. The kind of person who's just always thinking. And that comes across in the classroom. So the classroom was a very exciting, alive place to be. It was not a place where you got sort of manufactured lectures that had been rehearsed and re-rehearsed and re-rehearsed. It was a place where active thought was going on. And I like to run my classes that way too, partly because I don't prepare sufficiently in advance. So I have to think when I'm in the classroom. So she was inspiring. She was also the student of Oleg Grabar, who was very influential in this country. He continues to be very influential in that
one of the major scholars of Islamic art.
Scholars, yeah. And I think his gift to the field of art history, and particularly the history of Islamic art, is that he demanded that we not look at it solely formally, meaning what does it look like? Is it square? Is it round? Is it blue? Is it yellow? But what does it mean? What does it mean socially to the culture that produced it? So he's not the only one, but he was very influential in bringing social history into the history of Islamic art at that time, shifting it away from a more archaeological approach and from a more connoisseur approach, where you sort of decide whether something is of high value if it's by the hand of such and such an artist, or derivative and imitative. So I found that very inspiring because, of course, when I did my work on gardens and landscape, I had to ask what they meant.
Sure.
And I had to kind of think, why would a society put so much energy into making gardens? Who cares? Gardens, who cares? So those were two teachers who were very influential.
Talk to us a little bit about your more recent work, because I know you're working now not just on gardens, landscape art, but women and women's roles.
That's been an ongoing sort of quiet interest that's percolated in my head as I've worked on gardens and landscape. I've always been very interested in women, partly because I am one, and partly because when I was an undergraduate, there were only 2 tenured women on the faculty of the school where I went to school. And it was a school that had had women in it for a long time. My mother went to that school, my grandmother went to that school, but when I went to that school, there were 2 tenured women. So we're not that far removed from a time when there wasn't much space for women in positions of power, or at least there was space only for a very few elite women. So I've always been very interested in that. And I've, of course, been very interested in women in the arts, because I'm in the arts as well.
You're a woman who's an artist.
Yeah, and the Islamic world, again, the Western perception is that, well, these women had no power.
The women are oppressed, and there's no art.
And there's no art, right. And in fact, the opposite is true, that these were especially, perhaps only, but no, I think it's really more a matter of especially at the highest level, they were highly empowered and incredibly wealthy and great builders. And there's sort of a group of scholars who, since I'd say in the 1970s, but particularly in the 1990s, started studying these women patrons and asking, well, if women are so disempowered, why is it that the biggest buildings are built by women? What does that mean about the place of women in Islamic society? So I'm very interested in that. And I'm interested in the legal reasons why they build. I'm interested in the financial reasons why they build. The fact that women own their own property under Islamic law from the 7th century onward is a phenomenal means of empowerment. So that's
and people really aren't aware of that. I mean, I come from a Canadian context, a very, very famous case at the beginning of the 20th century. The persons case, are women considered persons under the law? when are women allowed to inherit property? Well, it's with the Brides Act. You know, it's not as early, nowhere near as early as the 7th century there. No. But there's been tremendous changes, because as you were talking about your experiences, I was thinking about, you know, not just you, but other great women who work in this field. So I'm thinking of someone like Alinda Komaroff, who's a curator of Islamic art at Los Angeles County Museum of Art, or Jerry Dodds, or Maria Menokau, or Sheila Blair. And so I think it's fabulous that there has been that growth of scholarship by women looking at these kinds of things.
There are, for reasons I don't fully understand, there are a lot of women in the field of Islamic art history. And that's not just Western women, but women around the world who work on this. I think some of it may have to do with the attraction of architecture as both a field of art that is a very powerful field of art, because you're building buildings as opposed to working somewhere in a studio where no one sees you. And also, I think that it's a high prestige profession in most parts of the world. To be an architect is, you know, a little bit like going to law school.
Absolutely, you're a professional.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's in the arts, so it's slightly more feminine, perhaps, than being a lawyer. I don't know. It's sort of, sometimes I think maybe that's why.
No, I hadn't thought about that, but that makes perfect sense too, that there is that creative aspect to it as well. I mean, you can come up with creative rulings and judgments, but it's not the same thing as deciding you want to organize the building this way or orient it that way.
And a lot of the women who go to architecture school end up writing about architecture, which is, you know, anyone can write about architecture in a way. You don't need a patron to give you $1 million to build a building. What you need is a desk, and then you can write. I mean, you need an education, you need a mind, of course, but it's something that I don't know. I don't know why exactly there's so many women in the field, but it's quite nice. But
it's been a great shift, though, to have that in that perspective of what does it mean to look at these kinds of things, because oftentimes, and I say this with all humility as a man, we don't see those kinds of things. We don't notice those details. We don't notice those differences. We don't notice that this shirt doesn't go with those pants. You know, that kind of look.
The wives will always tell you, though. Well, I mean, I think part of the reason why we have this emergence of the study of women is because we have women in the academy studying. But some of it, I think, is also a kind of questioning of what the subject of study ought to be, because it's not just women who have emerged as a subject of study, but also things like race, difference. I mean, I think part of the fascination with medieval Spain, for example, is that we no longer look to see whether we're talking about a Christian culture or an Islamic culture, but we can actually look at the seams where different cultures, different religions meet, and admit that that can be the center where we've studied, that's not the margins of Islam or the margins of Christianity. That's an exciting point of center in its own right.
Well, and the other part of it is, and you said this, it's the we. It's not just you looking at the material, but you in collaboration with other scholars. And your work has really been wonderful in that way of it's not just your own particular scholarly monographs, which of course are important, and that's how you get tenure in the university setting. But the collaborative work in some ways is more important. Can you talk to us, we've got a little bit of time left, about some of the collaborations?
Oh, I love working collaboratively. I really do, partly because you get to sort of live inside someone else's mind while you're co-writing. And I have co-edited a number of books and also journals with Bob Osterhout, a journal on the Mediterranean, looking at Byzantine, Western Christian and Islamic relations in the Mediterranean. I've co-edited a book with my colleague Diane Harris on vision and how vision and landscape must really have to be talked about in the same breadth. I've co-edited a book on gardens with an anthropologist colleague named Elizabeth Kreider-Reid. I've co-edited with a colleague on this campus named Helene Silverman. We're working very heavily in the field of cultural heritage. Looking at how the present uses its past, whether we're talking about Azhar Park, which is a perfect example of valuing the past in present creation, or also in the case of actual preservation projects where one chooses to preserve in some cases, or as I was saying, in the case of Doha, one chooses not to preserve the past, depending on what your present values are. And so all of those projects are things where I've really benefited from working with colleagues who, in some cases, are really much more expert than I am. And I learn. It's how, when you're a full professor, how else are you going to learn except by working with your colleagues?
With each other. Thank you you so much for allowing us to learn from you. Thank you for watching Perspectives on Faith. Our guest today has been Dr. D. Fairchild Ruggles, who is professor of landscape architecture, and art history at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. For Perspectives on Faith, I'm your host, Amir Hussain. Thank you for watching.